Currently he's teaching at the Uppsala University, and today he will talk about the main discrepancies between Persian and Kurdish historical novels. Please, Hashem.
Thank you very much, Hannah. Good morning, everybody. It is still morning. For me, it's really early in the morning. I'm very pleased to be here, and having been listening to my previous colleagues, I'll go on with another topic, and it is some sort of comparison between Persian and Kurdish historical novels. As a matter of fact, discussing all literary genres, one needs some sort of definition, a clear definition, to know what we are talking about, because the literary concepts, like any other concepts, are very problematic, and in different contexts, by different theories, and different ways of evaluating them, they mean differently for different people in different periods. One of these mainly problematic concepts is historical novel. In fact, the very concept of novel is very complicated. People have tried during the centuries to define it, and in the early 60s, 1960s, a British scholar actually said that the problem of defining the novel has caused me or resulted in seeing every text as a novel when the author or the publisher calls it a novel. Otherwise, one can categorize it sometimes as a history, as a factual book, or sometimes as a novel. Now, when it comes to the subdivision of the genre, which are many, about 26 subdivisions of the novel, different sort of the novels, one of them is historical novel. And here as soon as we look at the concept historical novel, we see a kind of contradiction in terms, something which is both a novel and a history. And here one needs, I cannot go through the definition of history, which is not less complicated and controversial than the novel, but generally speaking, by history we mean some sort of scientific approach to find out what happened in the past. By novel, which is mainly dealing with the fiction, we think about, or we mean that there is a fictional, there is a kind of text, story, not history. And in the story, we are not, generally speaking, supposed to ask the author or the one who narrates that be exact about the facts that you use. In other words, we have a dichotomy of fact and fiction, and this has been always there since the antique Greek, from the Aristotle. He refers to fact and he refers to fiction, and the discussion is still going on. People like David Lodge still talking about fiction is something that we cannot rely on that generally, but fact is there. And different approaches, especially within the philosophy, actually question these options or these ways of looking at the fact and fiction. Because in fiction, generally, we can find facts, and in facts, there are always risks that one fictionalizes, the very act of narrating the facts. But by saying this, by historical novel, one means, generally speaking, a narration in which history has been in the focus of that narration. But now here, which history and from which point of view and from which or how distance it should be from the author. In other words, if I am a novelist and I am writing now a historical novel, shall I talk about things that are going on now in Kurdistan and call them history? Now, when I come back to Kurdish historical novels, some of them actually are mainly political novels that deal with the current situation of Kurdistan. One of them is Kobani, for example, or in today's Syrian Kurdistan, a very famous Kurdish novelist, Can Dost, writes about all of them, has already published 8 novels, one can categorize them as historical novels, but they deal with the very contemporary current issues. Some theoreticians really refer to the very notion of historical novels and distinguish it from the political novel from the very time that we read them or they are written. Snow by Orhan Pamuk is a historical novel, but it deals with the contemporary issues in Turkey. And sometimes, you know, the historical novel, by time, they change their colors. If you go back to 1984 by George Orwell, at that time, actually, George Orwell didn't mean to write a historical novel. He, on the contrary, wrote a novel that should deal with 40 years afterwards, some sort of dystopia. But now, after some decades after 1984 that he meant when he was writing it in 1948, we can consider it as a historical novel. Then, depending on when we see the text, you know, the content or the label of a certain novel can be different. With having this in mind, the hybridity of historical novel dealing with both facts and fiction, we can easily see in the European context the rise of historical novel in the 19th century. Now, one may find novels before 19th century as historical novels, especially in French context, but when we talk about historical novel, we never do a favor discussion if we do not mention Georgi or George Lukács, because George Lukács has theorized both the idea of novel, the theory of the novel in a book, and historical novel in a longer book. According to him, the founder or the rise of the historical novel starts with Walter Scott, the Scottish or British author, and it is early 19th century with Waverley. Now, actually, he refers to the novels that have been referred to as historical novels earlier, Madame de Lafayette, for example, in French context, but for him, for Lukács, they are not sufficiently historical, because for him, as a Marxist, he follows the Marxist tradition in which literature generally can be seen as a context for reflecting the soul of history, the features of a certain epoch. And for him, for example, for Marx, Balzac, despite the fact he wrote for the king, but in his books, according to Marx, one can see the transformation of a certain formation of society to capitalism. And for Lukács, the same tradition, the same approach can be seen in Walter Scott's books, in seeing the changing or the soul of the certain time of a certain society that is going to be changed. Now, talking about Persian and Kurdish historical novels, one can, just like the novel itself, historical novels are mainly a borrowed genre. They came into Persian context through translation. During the late 19th century, early 20th century, translating historical novels from especially French into Persian was very popular. And as a matter of fact, late 19th century, early 20th century is a period in the whole Middle East, today's Russia and today's Turkey, Ottoman Empire. There was very radical social changes were going. And we can see the climax of these changes in different revolutions. If you look at 1905 revolution in Russia, 1908 in Ottoman Empire, the Young Turks Revolution, 1906 to 1911, the Constitutional Revolution in Iran, all, and later on 17, October Revolution, which comes to another epoch of history. All these revolutions highlight and are significant in seeing the changes, the social changes. These are things that go parallel, hand in hand. The rise of some sort of nationalism in Iran, it finds itself in constitutional revolution, and the social changes, the cultural changes, translations, and now starting parallel to these changes, writing historical novels. The interesting thing is that the early historical novels, one can say the first Persian historical novel was not written in Persian, but in Turkish, and it was translated into Persian by somebody else.
Azeri Turkish?
Not Azeri, but he was from Azerbaijan. Akhundov or Ahmadzadeh, Mirza Lutfali Ahmadzadeh, earlier Ahmadzadeh, and you see from the name Zadeh as some sort of Iranian construction. Later on, during the Soviet time, he was always referred to as Akhundov. And his book, which deals with the time of the Safavid Shah Abbas II, Shah Abbas, was translated by Mirza Ja'far Qarajadaghi from Turkish into Persian. You see here that it says a lot about actually the Persian nationalism, that it is not the main focus of my presentation. Otherwise, one can already see the very problematic nature of Persian nationalism in its literary reflection. Now, these Persian historical novels were very much affected by the European historical novels. One of the early European historical novels that was translated into Persian was in 3 volumes. And these actually resulted in a tradition in Iran. All Iranians who wrote in the beginning historical novels, they saw that it should be in more than 1 volume. And it went to an extension that people wrote novels in 10 volumes. And not necessarily the good scholars, but the teenagers. In a Persian literary history, one can find a very interesting reference to a guy who was 16 years old, and it has not been just referred by one historian in the case of Persian literature history, by Aryanpur, by Hassan Mir Abedini, by very recently Parsa Nasab, that a guy who was called Mu'tamin from Maragh actually, he wrote a book in 10 volumes, The Nest of Eagle, Ashane Uqab, when he was just 16 years old. Now people say, gosh, it is impossible. In Parsa Nasab, he has modified it. He started when he was 16 years old. But again, writing when you are 16 years old about, Hassan Sabah and, the time of Mongols, is not an easy task. But it says something that how popular the Persian novels were. And when I compare them with the Kurdish one, I see already that the very idea of journalism helped and strengthened this trend, this tendency, because there were many newspapers, magazines, that they have installments, Pavaraghi, and Pavaraghi Nivisi, just for entertaining the people, was something that the journals did. Now later on in the case of the Kurds, we do not see this. Installments and Pavaraghi Nivisi was not there actually, or is not there still, and one can understand why. It is not in today's technological era. Pavaraghi Nivisi is not so popular even in Europe, but going back to the early 20th century, Iran was very popular. And at the same time, the very ideological notion of Persian nationalism and taking the stance from the Arabic dominance, the Islamic dominance, as it was reflected in the defeat of the constitutional revolution and the rise of Reza Shah in 1920s, one actually encouraged writing about the pre-Islamic period in Iran's history. And it is why we see a lot of references to Kurush, to Dariush, Cyrus the Great, and almost in plenty of these novels, the story of these guys, in the Achaemenid state, in the Sassanid state, in some occasions the Samanid state, you see references to them and fictionalizing, the facts from those times that I'm afraid even the facts are fictionalized, or the result of some sort of romanticizing the nationalism. Because by nature, all nationalisms are romantic, and in nationalism you have this feature to go back in the history to dwell, in the history that we are so ancient, more ancient than the Arabs, than the Turks, and it is, general for all of them. The Arabs later on did, the Turks still do that, and even the Kurds. But when I come to the Kurdish, historical novels, I see actually a very main difference regarding this historicality and going back to the history. I have already talked about the first Persian novel, not in Persian, but in Turkish by translation of ھاشم. And the main backgrounds of the flourishing nature of Persian historical novels was the modernization, the urbanization, some sort of industrialization that went on in Iran, hand in hand during the early decades of the 20th century. And in all of these Persian historical novels, one glorifies the past. One finds some sort of security in the past. If, the time of the constitutional revolution, and probably the only revolution in the world, that its state is just dynamic from 6 to 11, rising, going down, and then, getting the power again, then is defeated, and you see the rise of Reza Shah, in a way that one by constitutional revolution meant to limit the power of the king, but Reza Shah probably has been the most powerful king in Iranian history, and the rise of the Pahlavis. And in the very name of the Pahlavis and the myth of Aryans and the title of the kings of the Pahlavi dynasty, Aryamer, you see another mythology, another myth that actually was strengthened by the Persian historical novels. In them, you refer to something that earlier one did not talk about, that Aryas, who were Aryais. And it came to the extension that Muhammad Reza Shah Pahlavi, the last Pahlavi king, was so much affected by this myth that he was referring to himself and the Iranians as the Aryans, as the Europeans. And it was a historical mistake that Iran was placed among all the other Altaic and Semitic, people, not in Europe. And it is something that its ground, its background, its rise goes back actually to the early 20th century, and establishing and constructing a kind of Persian identity and Aryan identity, and later on through the public education, extending it and dominating it and making it as a kind of identity for even non-Persians and for the Azeris. Because as I mentioned, Ahmadzadeh and later on some of other ideologues of the constitutional revolution were not Persian, they were Azeris, and they were very much affected by the social democracy in the Russian context in the early 20th century. But later on the direction of the revolution changes, and its aims were never fulfilled as far as the democratic rights of the non-Persians are considered. With having all these things about the Persian novel, I can say that during the Second World War, many other things happened politically, and the era of the historical novel just declined, and the rise of communism as an ideology and to the party in Iran in 1940s. But having said about the Persian novels, I must summarize it in order to talk about Kurdish historical novels as well. The very first question about the Kurdish historical novel is, all these famous when, where, and the content. Because when we talk about Persian novel, generally speaking, we talk about Iran, not Tajikistan, not Afghanistan. And as a matter of fact, Iran is the pioneer as far as the rise of the novel and historical novel in comparison to Tajikistan and Afghanistan. And novel in their context came very later on. But in the case of the Kurdish context, this division of Kurdistan among the at least 4 main nation states, imposes this question where and when. The where is interesting, not in the main Kurdish land, neither in Iran, Iran, Syria, or Turkey, but in Russia. and the whole idea of Kurdish novel. By whom? By the Kurds who had earlier migrated, mainly Yazidi Kurds, from Ottoman Empire to Russia, to Central Asia, and there they started, after especially the October Revolution, writing in Kurdish. And some of their novels can be considered as historical novels. And mainly one of them, Arabi Shamo, actually wrote wrote a novel, Qalaydim, the one that refers to probably the earliest event in Kurdish history, about the times of Safavids, 17th century. There are many other Kurdish novelists from different parts of Kurdistan that have written novels that can be read as historical novels, because this delicacy of considering something which is political or historical is there. In Atanhai's books, when he talks about the Kurdish Republic in the 1940s in Iranian Kurdistan, of course this is historical, but the very readers also in Kurdish do not consider them as historical. They usually say they are political novels. And it is because of comparing it to Persian. When you go back to the Achaemenids, 2,500 years ago, talking about 60, 40, 50 years are not enough historical. But during the recent decades, especially during the last 2 decades, a very famous Kurdish novelist, Can Dost, has written many novels about, different aspects of Kurdish society. And I have already published an article in Kurdish about Can Dost and his novels, generic features, especially the historical ones. By the way, he writes in both Arabic and Kurdish, and those books which are here are not all written by him in Kurdish, but some of them are written in Arabic, but later on have been translated into Kurdish. They are all dealing with the historical issues, while the Persian novels deal with actually an epoch, a period of history, Achaemenids, Sassanids, Samanids, Mongols, Seljuks. In the Kurdish case, we usually deal with individuals. For example, in Bijabad, we deal with the history of Kurdish Republic in Mahabad, 40s. In Segavan Sedarek, we deal, the historian, the novelist talks about Sheikh Said Piran of early 1920s, when he goes to be hanged by Ataturk in 1925. Again, Sheikh Said. In Martin Bakhtavar, the novelist talks about a fictional character who is called Martin, and he's not Kurd, of course. It goes back to the Middle Ages, somebody who is looking for, luckiness and his destiny in Orient, in Ottoman Empire from Europe. And Kobani deals with the very events in a few days ago when Daesh invaded Kobani and the Kurdish liberation forces liberated Kobani from Daesh and Islamists. And Khawnek Leser Minara is dealing with actually Syrian Kurdistan, very recent. And just another very important difference between the Kurdish ones, especially the Can Dost novels, and the Persian ones. In Kurdish ones, you can simply see the very fragmented nature of the Kurdish nationalist movement. In some of these novels, a Kurdish side of political movement has been condemned. But in none of the Persian historical novels, you see the condemnation of a Persian side. You glorify the past. Cyrus, great. Whatever he says is great. He is, the founder of the human rights, before, Jean-Jacques Rousseau or the French Revolution. But in the case of the Kurds here in Khawnek Leser Minara, is very much against the Kurdish forces that now administrate, these Kurdish cities in Syria and Kurdistan. It is something that you can never see in what's called Persian novels. In Ashiki Wargir, 2 volumes novel actually, the second volume has been called Zangakani Roma. Again, it is not about a specific Kurdish figure, and neither literary or nor what's called political, but an imaginary translator from Arabic into other languages during the 17th century. He goes to Italy from Ottoman Empire to learn, European languages, Latin or whatever, and after staying there for many years comes back to Ottoman Empire. He is not Kurd necessarily. Now, I have already compared them, but just reading them, when you read a Kurdish historical novel or a Persian one, is the idea of glorification and the idea, in the case of Persian, and the idea of fragmentation, both geographically and politically and even culturally, is very significant with the Kurdish novels. And these historical novels, in the case of the Kurdish, one can simply see, while in Persian context, you had already a tradition of storytelling. Okay, not novelistic discourse, but you had many epics, things like Shahnameh from the late 9th century, early 10th century, and 11th century, and many others during the whole Middle Ages. But in the Kurdish context, you have not access to that tradition. And the very rise of the novel in the very late 19th century, early 21st century, is something that differs itself with the Persian one, at least with 100 years. Thank you very much, and hopefully there are times to discuss further in replying to the answers.
We will have just a few minutes for questions. Yes, Hashem.
I have a question and a remark. Because you, maybe first the remark, you mentioned John Doss, that he writes some of his novels in Arabic and then they are translated by into Kurdish. That's right, but maybe it's important to add that they are translated by the author himself.
Not necessarily.
Not necessarily, but
In Sorani, none of them, he cannot write in Sorani. All of them are translated by Sabah.
If he writes in Arabic to Kurmanji, he translates it himself.
Sometimes he writes directly in Kurmanji, yes, without writing in Arabic. You are right. Yes. But as far as the Sorani is considered, all of them are translated.
Sorani, yes, but yes. Kurmanji he considers his native language.
True.
His last novel that is going to be published soon is with the Polish context and Żaba.
Alexander Żaba.
Yes. And I wanted to ask about what novel from Halim Yusuf's novel you consider historical?
Actually, mainly Sobarto is very historical, but the problem with Sobarto in comparing it with the Persian novel, it doesn't deal with a certain period of Kurdish history. Because this historiography, the Persian one, go to parallel. At the time of Reza Shah, the foreigners, the British and even French people, contributed to the flourishing of Persian historiography. History of Iran in 3 volumes, it was a factual book. And it is in that book that you refer to Achaemenids, Parthians and Ashkanis or whatever. Then parallel to that, somebody like Motemen reads them, I don't know if he read them or not, but writes Persian novels, historical ones. But Halim Yusuf writes Sobarto. Sobarto is a very imaginary country. You cannot locate it. Where was Sobarto? It is very fictional. And the fictional aspect in even John Doe's books, for example, the one that he has written about Mijabad, Mahabad, he has played with the word Mahabad, Mijabad, is the translation of Mahabad, which is Persian, to Mijabad. And Sheikh Said, the factional aspect, the facts are very rare. Because the whole book, the whole novel deals with the 3 steps that Sheikh takes before going to the, gallows. And fiction. But in the Persian ones, you have dates. Hassan Sabbah, Mongols, they invaded the cave and that time. Just something like Samarkand as a novel. Halil Youssef Subarto is real historical with what I said.
There's another question.
Just a comment, and I think, first of all, thank you so much. It was a great presentation. With the points about when and where, I think there was actually, what you mentioned was a little bit unfair assessments of where and when, because if you look at the novel in Afghanistan, for example, in case of Afghanistan, it actually started very much around a similar time. Now, I don't really know why you won't see much of historical traces in Persian accounts. I mean, specifically Iranian authors who are actually writing the history of novel or modern literature. But there are actually accounts. We have Jihad Akbar, for example. It happened to be a very historical novel as well.
And when was it published?
Published in end of the 13th century, solo calendar. So it's not really that
It is
far
early
off.
20th century, isn't it?
Once again?
It is early 20th
It's the very
century.
beginning of the 20th century. So this is not really that far off. However, we don't see any mention of that. But there are recently few Afghan researchers who actually pinpoint this beginning. They don't probably meet all the requirements of like a contemporary novel in the sense of Western novel, but they are actually very good attempts that we can call them at least. So I just want to...
No, you are absolutely right. Actually, you are right. But I'm afraid in the historiography of the Persian literature, they are not referred to. I'll check again, but as far as I know, Aryanpur, for example, his As-Sabat Anima, which is a very reliable, history of Persian literature. There is no mention, as far as I remember. I don't know. I'll check it, Jihad Akbar. But generally speaking, I have lived in Afghanistan. I am more or less familiar with Afghan, novelists. Neither Tajikistan nor Afghanistan cannot compete with Iran, and one can know why. There are social, historical, cultural, reasons. But thank you for your, remark. I'll check it.
دانشنامه ادب فارسی حسن همیشه definitely bring that, but this later on, and obviously it's actually good. But,
True.
But I understand
Yeah.
the point very
Yeah.
clear.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I'm afraid we don't have the time for further questions.
Thank you.